Welcome to Impact Pasadena, and it's my pleasure to introduce today the president and CEO of the Pasadena Community Foundation, Jennifer DeVoll. And for those of you who don't know about the Pasadena Community Foundation, it's an organization that's been around for 60 years, helping out the Pasadena community in all kinds of ways that we're going to talk about today. They now manage over $80 million in assets. Is that right, Jennifer?
That's right, yeah.
Which is, I think, a lot of growth in the last 15 years since you actually have been president and CEO. So I'm so delighted to have you here. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
Oh, great.
Appreciate it.
So I wanted to ask, first of all, about the history of PCF. I know that you had a very distinguished founder, Lewis Webb. And he and his wife started the foundation in 1953, I believe, if my research is correct.
Right. Yes.
So tell me a little bit about that family and how they got involved in this foundation.
So Lewis and Marion Webb lived in Pasadena on Mountain Street, and they had no children, but they had kind of amassed what in their day was a fortune. He was an engineer who had come out here and built power plants up and down the West Coast and then got into real estate development. And he was quoted in the Star News as saying that he wanted to give away his fortune while keeping it intact. And he knew about the Community Foundation concept, and he in fact founded, so he wrote his trust in July of 1953, and basically with a pledge of his estate to the Pasadena Foundation, which was the name that it started with. And so in July of 1953, he drafted his trust, and he said, I leave my wealth to the Pasadena Foundation if there is one. And he founded the foundation 6 months later in December of 1953. It was interesting, he died then in 1966, and his half of their assets came to the foundation at that time, and then his wife died 12 years later, and then her half came. So over the course of 25 years, their assets came into the foundation. They were worth about $2.5 million, and today, so that money was taken into the foundation and invested, and today those funds, the Marion Lewis Webb Endowment, is valued at over $12 million. Great. And essentially the model was to invest those assets and distribute grants to local nonprofit organizations and invite others to establish endowments for the good of the community. That was sort of his vision. When I came to the foundation, the very end of 2002, so it was sort of on the eve of the 50th anniversary, there were about $16 million in assets, maybe 40 to 50 charitable funds under the umbrella, mostly bequests that had been left to us, like the Webbs. But I didn't know that much about the history of the foundation, so I started calling people who'd been involved, past board members and so forth. And I landed on Mrs. Webb's hairdresser and housekeeper. And learned a lot about the Webbs and who they were, and
because the housekeepers and the hairdressers know everything.
They knew everything, so I learned quite a bit. From, Linnea White was the housekeeper, and Frances Hamilton, whose son was a helicopter police officer who flew helicopters for the Pasadena Police Department. But they told me some stories, and I'll just share two. Mr. Webb was quite a frugal man, and very conservative in his spending. And so he was he didn't want to pay for a safe deposit box at the bank. And back in the day, you actually had stock and bond certificates. So he hid them under his dining room rug, so they didn't have to pay for a safe deposit box.
This is why he amassed a fortune,
right?
Obviously.
And he ate at Beadle's Cafeteria every day for lunch. He was not a very social person. He was actually quite shy. But after he died, his wife took their housekeeper, her hairdresser, Frances Hamilton, to Hawaii 10 times, an annual trip to Hawaii. And so she was not quite as frugal as he was, but nevertheless, they did leave their fortune to Pasadena.
This is great. I had learned just in researching that the idea of a community foundation is actually a concept that has grown nationally. I assume it was somewhat new at the time that Mr. Webb founded it, but what is a community foundation?
Yeah.
Could you fill us in?
Well, the concept of community foundations, they were actually started in 1915, and they celebrated their sort of centennial year. But they have, there has been a great growth in the number of community foundations. There are now 800 around the country. They are organized geographically. So, for example, in California, there's about 30 of them, and they are primarily organized by county. So you have the San Diego Foundation, Orange County, all the way up to Humboldt County. And then you have some smaller community foundations like Pasadena that are more sort of city-based, or a couple of cities. And then you actually have some that are statewide, a state like...
So you say smaller, how does Pasadena Community Foundation, in terms of assets, where do they fit in? I know you have about 80 million.
We now have about $80 million in assets, about 350 charitable funds. Most community foundations, you hear about the very large ones, but most of them are actually, if you're looking at the bell curve, probably most of them are sort of between $50 and $200 million. So we're sort of in that, zone of pretty average.
So what's the charter for a community foundation? I mean, I understand that most people would think of it as grant giving or giving to nonprofits, but you also have a lot of other aspects to what you do.
Yeah.
Could you kind of explain that for us?
So community foundations, they sort of look, they're sort of a bit of a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. They have a grant-making identity that sometimes people confuse us with private foundations, which are grant-making entities. And we also look at like public charities in that we are fundraising organizations. And it's actually part of our mandate to fundraise, to develop resources for a local geographic area. And so the way that we do our fundraising is primarily through having people set up and establish charitable funds under our umbrella. So again, I mentioned that we have $80 million in assets, about 350 charitable funds. Those funds we have maybe 7 different types of funds that people can set up under our umbrella. And they range from what we would call our discretionary endowments, our endowment builders, where people are just leaving money or giving money to Pasadena saying, we love our community, we trust your knowledge, do good things with it, give out grants to organizations that need it, all the way to sort of a spectrum of essentially creating kind of mini family foundations under our umbrella, where the donors are really directing their own grant making. We are facilitating that. We're providing administrative support, compliance. But the donors are really directing their own grant making, and that can be locally or anywhere in the country.
What about managing the assets? All the paperwork and the investment decisions. How does that work?
Right. So we have like most nonprofit public charities, we have a board. We have an 18-member board. Our finance committee of the board hires professional investment manager. We happen to use Vanguard Institutional as our primary investment manager to invest most of that $80 million. Not all of it is actually invested in the market. So there's oversight in that way.
So do you would invest the $80 million overall, and then, in other words, you don't manage the investments for the individual foundations.
They're pooled for investment purposes. So that probably about 70 million of the 80 is in the Vanguard portfolio, and it's pooled for investment purposes. But we actually track the funds as separate individual funds. And on the endowment side, because not all of our funds are endowed, but many of them are, I'll just tell you a quick story. We received a bequest in 1996 from a woman by the name of Cornelia Eaton. She and her husband had lived in Pasadena. We don't know much about them. We know that he delivered the Herald Examiner, and that they lived in what is now the sort of the line of the 210 freeway, so their house is no longer there. But they left their estate to the Pasadena Community Foundation with the restriction that we provide for seniors living in the city of Pasadena.
Uh-huh.
So they left a bequest of $850,000. So we invested that money. We have made grants from the Cornelia Eaton Endowment Fund of $950,000 over that 20-plus year period, and their fund is now valued at $1.5 million.
Yeah.
So it's sort of that power of endowment where
Sure.
that original gift or bequest is really the engine that generates grant money for the community.
So that's a great example, because you usually think of foundations as being funded by extremely wealthy people, but if I'm a retired school teacher or a college professor and I have an estate, I can make an endowment that could go on in perpetuity, basically continue to grow and have an impact on the community. So it's not just for the extremely rich to do this.
No, and in fact, our assets have come, really from people that you might not have ever heard of.
Yeah.
It's
the millionaire
really,
next door.
the millionaire next door,
yeah.
kind of the average person. Certainly in today's world, a lot of people have money in their house, but they're not wealthy people in terms of their income or even their investable assets. But we have had many generous people. I like to say we're not for wealthy people, we're for generous people.
Yeah, that's a great way to say it. It's
Yeah.
a great way to say it. Well, let me ask you just in general then about the, I know you work in several different areas of grant making, and before we get into the specific areas, maybe talk a little bit about the nonprofit environment right now in terms of grant making. I know that people are knocking on your doors all the time asking for money, and you have to make a lot of tough decisions about where to deploy that. So if you could talk a little bit about the environment in terms of raising money for nonprofits and the grantsmanship that you have to do.
Sure. So let me just give you a little framework for,
Please.
we mentioned that we have $80 million in assets. Of that pool of money, about $35 million are assets that there's over 100 funds that make up that $35 million. And that is money that people have given to the foundation either by bequest or through establishing a current endowment with us. But they give PCF the discretion to award grants from that money. So we have endowments that are unrestricted, and we have endowments that are restricted to arts, education, health. So people have a particular passion, they might restrict to an area of interest. So we're now managing money, some of which is unrestricted, some of which is restricted, and we have an annual competitive grants process where if you serve the local community as a nonprofit, you can apply to us for a grant, and we read the application, we do a lot of site visits, we look at the financials of these organizations, so we do sort of a fair amount of vetting and due diligence. And then of course we award grants, our board gets involved in that, in awarding grants. Not every organization gets funded every year, of course. There's always more requests than money.
What are the numbers like in terms of grant requests and actually grants that you give?
So yeah, we probably get about 60 to 65 grant applications in that process each year, and fund maybe 40.
Okay.
So we've worked hard to say yes more than no.
Yeah.
and
Well, it sounds like you do.
We do limit our grants to $25,000 is the top grant, so usually they're range between $10,000 and $25,000.
Okay.
But we like to grant broadly in Pasadena. We value our urban forest and parks and trees, and we value the arts organizations, and we value the social services, kind of safety net organizations.
Well, I know also that you are Well, I should mention I'm on the PCC Board of Trustees, and we've had conversations about how to, in the education area. So I know that you're very proactive in the sense that you're just not waiting for grants to come in. You're looking for opportunities to give and to get the biggest bang for your buck, I guess you'd say, in terms of development. So it's a two-way street, isn't it, between your interests and the grantees? So
a couple comments on that. We do have an education grants program. So our history as an organization is that for the first, 15 years there were no staff. Then there was one staff person for 25 years, and so we had very little staff. And so a big part of our grant making was capital and equipment grants. Somebody needs a van, we buy a van. Yeah. They give us the receipt. It's
very helpful.
Very helpful, but fairly simple grant making. Yeah. Since we've had some growth, we have developed some. We still do our capital and equipment grant making, but we have developed some other grants programs as we've gotten assets that merit sort of their own application process. And I mentioned the senior grants from the Eaton Fund. That has actually, our senior grants have a separate application, and we've also created a separate program for education grants. Our focus for our education grants is K through 12 PUSD. So we don't fund private schools or hire the private colleges. So our education grants focus on K through 12 academic intervention to help sort of close the achievement gap for kids. And so
I do want to talk a lot more about education, but before we leave the macro view, what's the environment now for just general charity giving and nonprofits? I mean, how has that changed, or is it improved?
I think there's a couple of things that are hot topics in the media these days. Yeah. Certainly, one is tax reform, and the question there is because they have raised the amount of the standard deduction. There is a projection that there will be maybe as much as 61% less people who are filing an itemized tax return. Yes. And so therefore, if you are not filing an itemized return, you're really getting no benefit to your charitable gifts. Yeah. They're sort of, you're just taking the standard deduction.
Right.
So there's a question whether that is going to affect charitable giving, and I think we're in sort of the first year of tax reform. Hard to tell yet. So hard to tell, but I think there's some fear that will have a negative impact on charitable giving. We fortunately live in a very generous community, and I think a lot of people give because they believe in giving, and it's there's a value to that in this community. Right. So we hope that won't happen, that people won't see a cutback in
Is it depend on economics? I mean, economic times, did you see a dip after 2008, for example?
Yes, I think what was also very impacted by the recession was private foundation giving. So many nonprofits, in addition to getting individual donor support, who were impacted by the recession, they were also getting private foundation support. There's a lot of private foundations in our region that support local nonprofits. Right. And private foundations, because they're not fundraising organizations, they're really living with a static corpus of money.
A private foundation being something that's given by an individual or
the things that you think of, the Ford Foundation,
the
Gates Foundation. Okay. So that's typically one donor creating their own foundation. Okay. And a private foundation has a mandatory distribution of 5% of their assets annually by law. And so if their assets dip down, as they did in the recession, then their available allowance, if you will, for grant making shrinks along with their asset base. And there's no fundraising involved, so they can't really make that up. So they have to cut back.
So are you a 501c3? Is that how you are?
We are, yes. We are a public charity. A community foundation, by definition, is a public charity and not a private foundation.
Right.
Right.
Good. Well, let's get back to the meat and potatoes of some of the grants giving. I mean, you started talking about education, and I know that that's a top priority for you and a lot of citizens in Pasadena. I know we have a population where 40% of the school children are actually in private schools, and so this has created some problems for PUSD in terms of enrollment, in terms of diversity.
Right.
And I know that PUSD has gone through some rocky periods in its history. But by all accounts, it's a fine school system, and I think that the more community involvement that we have, the better it's going to get. So what are you looking at in terms of PUSD? Because I know it's a focus for you.
Well, they are having, of course, it's no secret that they're having budget challenges. I think what a lot of our funding has gone to nonprofits that kind of work in collaboration with PUSD to support PUSD children. So, for example, Reading Partners is a national program with a very strong presence in Pasadena. I believe that they were have been in about 7 of the elementary schools, and they take kids who are, for example, 18 months behind reading level, so maybe a second grader who's reading at sort of a kindergarten level, and they have a intervention program where they work with that kid one-on-one with the help of volunteers.
Right.
They follow a particular curriculum, and they get that kid up to reading level.
Right.
And so, that's one of the organizations that we fund through our education grants, but there are others that really do great work with PUSD kids and really supplement the work being done in the classroom.
So you find nonprofits who are kind of intervening in areas where the PUSD might need a boost.
That's right.
And you
yeah.
support them.
Right. And so we have had, we support about 5 organizations in that way each year, some of which are doing summer intervention programs, because that's a very, it's known that lower income families don't get sort of the enrichment that they need through the summers, and the kids can fall behind.
Yeah.
And then there are kind of after school and in-school programs that provide really effective interventions to help the children.
I have to make note of, because you and I have both been involved with something called the Math Academy,
Yes.
which is you want to just briefly say what that is?
Right. So I mean, that's the other thing that I think is really there's a lot of really interesting programs within PUSD that I don't think get quite enough attention, but one of them is this Math Academy, and essentially it's a program that was started by a guy, Jason Roberts, who started out just volunteering to coach the math field team at McKinley.
He was a dad who I think
He's
has a lot of software experience. I think he designed some of the Uber software.
Right,
but,
exactly.
Yeah.
And his kid was sort of on the math field team, and he started working with this group of, I think, 5th graders at the time, and started sort of pushing them to do a little more, go a little faster. And fast forward, Math Academy was sort of born out of this, and it's sort of a radically accelerated math program for middle school, and now this first cohort of kids will be starting at PHS in 9th grade, but it's now in 3 schools, well, soon to be 4, McKinley, Sierra Madre middle schools, Washington Middle School, and now it'll start at PHS. And these kids, I mean, we do a lot of site visits, and I've been on hundreds of site visits, and I was on the McKinley campus, and I sort of, ducked into this math class, and these 11-year-old kids are doing, multivariable equations on the whiteboard.
They're doing calculus in 6th grade.
And I'm going, wow, what is this? And it was just crazy. So it's now, in 6th, 7th, and 8th and 9th grades, and the 8th graders, I think in 7th grade, at the end of the 7th grade, they took the high school AB calculus exam and passed, and in 8th grade, they took the BC calculus exam. So they're basically done with high school math by the end of 8th grade. And So that's been a really exciting
Yeah, it just shows
program.
what happens when you really can challenge
Yeah.
students, and they come from diverse backgrounds, and
Yeah.
it's. Anyway, I wanted to get that in because I think that's such an astounding
Yes,
kind of program,
right.
and an example of what you might be doing with. In this case, it was sort of an informal group of parents, I think, who started
Right.
it. But
And when I saw that program sort
Yeah.
of in action, almost by accident, frankly, I thought about an individual donor and also a foundation that I knew of that might have a real interest in funding that. And so just through kind of, just being boots on the ground
Yep.
and just being out in Pasadena, seeing a lot of things, I was able to bring both an individual donor and a foundation funder to the program to help them sort of get started and have some of that seed money to get rolling.
I think that's a terrifically important point, because it's not just when you're running a nonprofit on the ground and you're kind of a shoestring operation, you really don't know about the sources of funding very well. And what you can do, I think, is you may be familiar with the donor community and say, so-and-so really has an interest in accelerated math programs, and put those two people together,
Right.
which is it's facilitating rather than simply just writing checks. I think is that right?
I mean, I do think we've been able to. I think one of the things that that I feel good about kind of what has happened with the foundation, over, during the last 15 years since I've been there is, yes, we've grown, and yes, our assets have grown, but I think we've also become more collaborative. And we have worked with the city on some projects. We have looked for ways to do more than just write a check. I mean, checks are great.
Yep.
I'm never one to not love checks.
I hear you.
Both getting them and giving them.
Yeah.
But there are some other ways that the foundation has sort of been able to support the broader nonprofit community. And, just one example is that we have 2 years ago, we decided to pursue getting licensed for charitable gift annuities. And charitable gift annuities are a sort of a tool, planned giving tool, that usually is only available to the large universities, maybe the large hospitals.
I see.
Because it's expensive to get licensed. It takes a fair amount of administration to stay licensed. And we thought if we get our license, we can actually lend it to some more grassroots and mid-sized nonprofits in the community who aren't licensed and who it would not make sense to get their license. And
Yeah.
so we have actually, we're still relatively new at this, but we've actually written now 3 charitable gift annuities, one of which has benefited Pasadena Community Foundation, but the other 2 that have benefited other organizations, one the Pasadena Senior Center, one Union Station. So,
Right.
so these donors come in, they work with the Pasadena Community Foundation to create a gift annuity, which is basically a product where the donor gets an income stream for life, and then the charitable
Right.
component of the gift goes to the nonprofit. And so they've been able to benefit Union Station and then the Senior Center.
Yeah.
And so that's a way that we have, I think, amplified our impact and been more collaborative with the local nonprofit community. And there's some other ways.
Right. Well, that's fascinating, and it's really the forward-looking approach to what you do. This has been fascinating, and I think we've got a lot more to talk about. So if you're able to stay, we're going to do another segment. We're going to talk about some of the granting areas and the work that you do. So Jennifer, thank you so much for being with us.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Wow.
This is great.